This 4-year-old beggar girl says, "Run me over with that car." When the millionaire finds out why, he immediately breaks down. Comment what you think is going to happen. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The red light flashed on Elm Street when Richard Huntington braked his black BMW. The 52-year-old businessman adjusted the air conditioning and checked the watch on the dashboard, late for a meeting with the suppliers of Central Bakery. His fingers drummed on the leather steering wheel as he observed the typical traffic of downtown Oak Haven on a Thursday afternoon. It was then that a soft tap on the side window caught his attention. A barefoot little girl, with her face dirty and her hair disheveled, gestured asking him to lower the window. Richard sighed. Just another kid begging. Normally he ignored these situations, not out of a lack of heart, but because of a pragmatic philosophy he had developed over the years. Giving money on the streets only fed the cycle of dependency. But something in that girl's eyes made him hesitate. They were eyes that seemed to carry an immense weight for someone who appeared to be only 6 years old. Against his own rule, Richard lowered the window a few inches. "Please, mister." The child's voice came out weak, almost a whisper. "Run me over with that car. I want to go to heaven and meet my mom." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He immediately turned off the car and got out, ignoring the horns of the vehicles behind him. The girl took a step back, frightened by the sudden reaction of the tall man in the dark suit. "What was that, kid? What did you say?" Richard knelt on the hot asphalt, getting down to the child's height. His heart was beating fast. "I said I want to die, mister," she repeated with a terrifying naturalness. "My mom is in heaven, and I want to go there too. Aunt Betty said that when we die, we meet the people we love." Richard felt the world spin. In 10 years of running that family business, dealing with employees, suppliers, and all sorts of business problems, he had never faced a situation like this. His businessman's instinct screamed at him to get back in the car and go on with his life. But there was something in those dark eyes that held him there. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Isabel," the girl replied, wiping her nose on her torn sleeve. "And do you have a name?" "Richard. Richard Huntington." He looked around and noticed that some people were stopping to watch the scene. "Isabel, where are your parents? My mom went to heaven because I was very bad to her. I never saw my dad." The girl lowered her eyes. "Now I live on the street with Betty and Grandpa Walter." The green light came on and the cars behind started, honking more insistently. Richard got up, but he couldn't just walk away. There was something about that child that stirred painful memories that he preferred to keep buried. "Isabel, are you hungry?" he asked. The girl nodded energetically, and for the first time a small glimmer appeared in her eyes. "Do you know the Drummond Bakery near the square?" "Yes, I know it. Sometimes I stand outside smelling the bread." "I'm going to leave a special snack there for you, okay? But promise me something." Richard crouched down again. "Never say those things about wanting to die again. Your mom wouldn't be happy hearing that." Isabel stared at him for long seconds, as if she were assessing whether she could trust that strange man in the expensive suit. Finally, she nodded. Richard returned to the car with wobbly legs. During the rest of the drive to the meeting, he couldn't get the image of that girl out of his head. Her words echoed like a persistent echo. "I want to go to heaven and meet my mom." At the meeting with the suppliers, Richard was completely distracted. He agreed to prices he would normally question and signed contracts without his usual thorough analysis. His partners noticed the distraction, but didn't comment. At 5 in the afternoon, he drove to Central Bakery. The location operated on a busy corner with large glass windows that displayed the golden loaves and colorful sweets. Richard found the manager, Valerie, organizing the cash register for closing. "Valerie, I need you to set aside a complete snack. Bread, milk, cake." For a child who will pass by here, a girl named Isabel. Valerie, a woman in her 40s, with a perpetually serious expression, raised her eyebrows. Street kid, boss? You know they always come back asking for more, right? Just do what I'm asking, Richard replied more dryly than he intended. He left the bakery without further explanation, but throughout the night he couldn't sleep. The image of Isabel asking to die haunted him. In his silent mansion in the upscale neighborhood of Oak Haven, Richard walked from room to room, trying to understand why that child had affected him so much. Maybe it was because at 6 years old, she already carried a pain that he knew well, the pain of losing someone important, the pain he himself had felt since Olivia had passed away 10 years ago, a victim of an aggressive cancer that took her in just 4 months. The next morning, Richard woke up with a decision that surprised himself. He needed to know more about Isabel. He needed to understand how a child so small had reached the point of wishing for her own death. What he didn't imagine was that this decision would completely change the course of his life, bringing to light secrets that were much closer to him than he could ever suspect. The next morning, Richard cancelled his meetings and drove to City Square, where he had first seen Isabel. Downtown Oak Haven was bustling with street vendors, students, and hurried workers, but there was no sign of the girl. He spent 2 hours walking the adjacent streets until he spotted a familiar figure, an elderly man with grey hair sitting under the awning of the old bus station. At his feet, 2 small children were sharing a piece of bread. Richard approached cautiously. "Excuse me, do you know a girl named Isabel?" The man looked up suspiciously. It was a face marked by time and hardship, but his eyes retained genuine kindness. "Who wants to know?" "My name is Richard Huntington. I spoke with her yesterday and I was worried." "Walter Stevens," the man introduced himself, extending a calloused hand. "Isabel and Betty are like granddaughters to me. I've been taking care of them since they were left alone." Richard sat on the ground next to Walter, ignoring the expensive suit he was wearing. "She told me her mother died. Can you tell me what happened?" Walter sighed deeply. "Lucy was a hard-working woman. She worked as a cleaner to support the twins. She had a heart problem, but she hid it from everyone so she wouldn't lose her job." "Where did she work?" "At a bakery here downtown. Drummond, I think it was called." Walter observed Richard's reaction. "Do you know it?" Richard felt his blood run cold. It's my company." A heavy silence settled between the 2 men. Walter narrowed his eyes, as if he were re-evaluating the stranger in front of him. "So you're her boss," he said finally. "Well, know that your employee Valerie fired Lucy 3 days before she died. She said she was too slow and was setting a bad example for the others." Richard felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Valerie fired a sick employee? The poor woman came home crying." Walter continued, his voice choked. "She told the girls that she was going to look for another job the next day. But the next day, she didn't wake up. Her heart couldn't take it." The pieces were beginning to fall into place in Richard's mind. Lucy had died 3 days after being unfairly fired. Her daughters were left completely helpless, and Isabel carried the guilt for something that happened on the last day of her mother's life. "Walter, why does Isabel think she's to blame for her mother's death?" The elderly man wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "On the last day, Lucy was trying to give Isabel her heart medicine. The girl didn't want to take it because it was bitter. They argued, and Isabel shouted that she hated her mother. That night, Lucy had the heart attack." Richard clenched his fists. The guilt he felt now was overwhelming. If Valerie hadn't fired Lucy, she might not have gone through the stress that precipitated her death. And a 6-year-old child was carrying on her back the weight of a normal fight between mother and daughter. Where are the girls now? Betty went to collect cans with some older children. Isabel is sleeping over there. Walter pointed to a cardboard spread behind a column. She hasn't been well since yesterday. She coughs a lot and has a fever. Richard stood up immediately. We need to take her to the doctor. With what money, young man? Walter laughed bitterly. Street kids don't have health insurance or ID. A private hospital costs a fortune. I'll pay, said Richard without hesitation. Walter studied him for long moments. Why? Why would a rich man like you want to help us? It was a question that Richard couldn't answer completely. There was the obvious guilt over Lucy's unfair dismissal, but there was something deeper, a connection he didn't understand. Because it's the right thing to do, he replied finally. When they arrived at the cardboard where Isabel was sleeping, Richard saw a scene that broke him in half. The girl was curled up like a kitten, shivering with cold even under the strong morning sun. Her breathing was labored, and her cheeks were red with fever. Isabel, Walter shook her gently. Wake up, honey. There's someone here who wants to help you. The girl opened her eyes slowly. When she saw Richard, a weak smile appeared on her face. The man with the pretty car. That's right, I came to take you to the doctor, okay? Isabel tried to sit up but was seized by a coughing fit that left her breathless. Richard didn't hesitate any longer. He picked up the girl in his arms and walked towards his car. Walter, come with us. She'll need you. On the way to the private hospital, Richard called Valerie. I need to talk to you urgently about Lucy Silver. Who? The manager's voice sounded evasive. The cleaner you fired 6 months ago. I want to know exactly why you dismissed her. There was a long pause on the line. Boss, I don't understand why you're digging up old matters. Answer my question, Valerie. She was very slow, arrived late, complained about the work. She was no longer fit to work. Richard hung up the phone, knowing that there was much more behind that dismissal than Valerie was revealing. At the hospital, while the doctors examined Isabel, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to investigate thoroughly what really happened to Lucy Silver. What he didn't know was that this investigation would trigger a series of events that would put at risk everything he had built throughout his life. At the hospital, Isabel's diagnosis confirmed Richard's fears. Pneumonia in its early stages, severe malnutrition, and anemia. The girl would need to stay in the hospital for at least a week. While she slept sedated, Richard sat next to the bed, watching that thin, pale little face. Dad, what the hell are you doing here? The sharp voice made Richard turn around. David Huntington, his 28-year-old son, was standing at the door of the room with an expression of disapproval that Richard knew well. The young lawyer wore an impeccable suit and carried a leather briefcase, always ready for business. How did you know I was here? Valerie called me worried. She said you were acting strangely, investigating former employees. David approached the bed, looking at Isabel with disdain. Who is this child? Daughter of a former employee of ours, Lucy Silver. And why are you paying for a private hospital for a street kid? David's voice had an accusatory tone that irritated Richard deeply. Because it's the least I can do after our manager unfairly fired her mother. David sighed, running his hand through his perfectly combed hair. Dad, you can't solve all of Oakhaven's social problems. We have a company to run, employees who depend on us, serious responsibilities. And this girl isn't a serious responsibility. She's not our responsibility. David's voice rose, causing a nurse to poke her head in the door to check if everything was okay. Sorry, he lowered his voice. Dad, you're letting emotion make decisions that should be rational. Richard stood up, facing his son. Do you know what was the last thing your mother told me before she died, David? The young man was uncomfortable. They rarely talked about Olivia since her death. No. She said, Richard, don't let your heart harden after I'm gone. Money will never give you what you really need. Richard looked at Isabel again. It took me 10 years to understand what she meant. David clenched his fists. My mother wasn't thinking straight. The morphine affected her judgment. The slap came before David could dodge it. Richard had hit his son for the first time in his life. "Never talk about your mother that way again," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "Never again." David touched his reddened face, his eyes shining with anger and humiliation. "See? You're not thinking straight. You're letting this situation mess with your head. Get out of here, David, now. Fine, but know that I'm going to keep an eye on the company's finances. If you start spending our inheritance on social projects, I'll take the necessary measures." David adjusted his suit and left the room, leaving a heavy tension in the air. Richard sat down again, disturbed by the confrontation with his son. In the last few hours, his life had become a whirlwind of emotions that he hadn't felt in years, and all because of a girl who had asked to die at a traffic light. 3 days later, with Isabel stabilized but still in the hospital, Richard decided to confront Valerie directly. He arrived at Central Bakery during the lunch rush and found the manager supervising the employees with her usual efficiency. "Valerie, I need to talk to you in private." She followed him to the office in the back of the bakery, where Richard closed the door and turned to face her. "I want you to tell me the truth about Lucy Silver." "I already explained, boss. She wasn't making enough money." "That's a lie." Richard placed a file on the table. "I've spoken with other employees. Lucy was one of the best cleaners we've had. Never missed a day, never arrived late. Always praised for the quality of her work." Valerie's face paled slightly. "People lie to protect their friends, including Rose from the kitchen." "She told me that Lucy cleaned twice as much as anyone else could." Richard approached. "She also told me that you had a personal vendetta against Lucy, that you were always picking on her for no reason." Valerie crossed her arms defensively. "I have to maintain discipline among the employees. Discipline is one thing, persecution is another." Richard opened the file and showed some papers. "These are Lucy's timesheets for the last 6 months of work. 0 absences, 0 tardiness. And here," he showed another document, "is the evaluation that you yourself did of her 3 months before the dismissal. Top marks in all categories." Valerie was silent, but Richard could see the sweat starting to form on her forehead. "Now I'm going to ask one last time. Why did you fire Lucy Silver?" The woman took a deep breath as if she were making a difficult decision. "Because she was asking too many questions." "What kind of questions?" "About the suppliers, about the prices, about discrepancies in the inventories." Valerie avoided Richard's gaze. She was too curious for a cleaner. An alarm sounded in Richard's mind. "Valerie, are you embezzling products from the company?" "No, of course not." The answer came too quickly, too defensively. Richard realized that he had touched a sensitive point. "I want a complete audit of all inventories today." "Boss, that's not necessary. I can explain any discrepancy. The only explanation I want is why you destroyed the life of an innocent woman." Richard headed for the door. "And why a 6-year-old child is hospitalized because you left her family in misery." When he left the bakery, Richard felt that he had only discovered the tip of the iceberg. Valerie was clearly hiding something bigger, and Lucy had been fired because she was getting too close to the truth. That night, when he returned home, Richard found David waiting in the living room with a pile of documents. "Dad, we need to talk seriously," said his son without looking up from the papers. "I've done an analysis of the company's finances in recent months. There are some irregularities that worry me." Richard poured himself a whiskey and sat in the armchair in front of his son. "What kind of irregularities?" "Discrepancies in the inventory reports, payments to suppliers that don't match the actual deliveries, and David hesitated. Transfers to accounts that I don't recognize. The revelation hit Richard like a bolt of lightning. If David had discovered irregularities on his own, it meant that the problem was bigger than he imagined. And it also meant that Lucy Silver had died because she was about to expose something that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. 3 weeks had passed since Richard discovered the irregularities in the company. The situation had deteriorated in a frightening way. 2 bakeries had already lost important suppliers who claimed delays in payments that, according to Valerie's records, had been made promptly. Isabel had been discharged from the hospital, but her condition was still fragile. Richard had arranged a small apartment for her, Betty, and Walter, but the girl refused to eat properly and spent hours in silence, lost in thoughts that a 6-year-old shouldn't have. "She's not getting better," said Walter one morning, while they watched Isabel play distractedly with dolls that Richard had bought. "The body is healing, but the soul is still sick." Richard knew that the man was right. Isabel smiled when she saw him, but it was a forced smile. Lifeless, she still carried the guilt for her mother's death, and nothing he said seemed to alleviate that burden. "Grandpa Walter," Isabel's weak voice interrupted Richard's thoughts. "Why is Mr. Huntington so good to us? We're not his family." Simple question cut deep into Richard's heart. He himself couldn't completely explain his obsession with helping those children. It was more than guilt over Lucy's dismissal. It was as if, by taking care of them, he was trying to fill a void that had existed in his life for years. "Sometimes," Walter replied gently, "God puts special people in our path when we need them most." At that moment, Richard's cell phone rang. It was David, and his voice sounded tense. "Dad, you need to come to the office now. We have a serious problem." When Richard arrived at the company office, he found David pale, surrounded by papers scattered across the table. "What happened?" "Valerie has disappeared," said David bluntly, "along with all the original documents from the last 2 years. And there's more. She withdrew $200,000 from the company account before disappearing." Richard slumped into a chair. "How is that possible?" "She had access to the accounts as general manager. She forged your signature on several transfers." David showed bank statements. "Dad, we're practically bankrupt. She not only stole money, but she must have sold information to our competitors. 3 suppliers cancelled contracts this week." Reality hit Richard like an avalanche. Valerie had planned everything meticulously. She fired Lucy because the woman was discovering her fraud, and now, when she realized that she would be exposed, she decided to flee with what was left of the company. "There's more," continued David, his voice laden with accusation. "I found out that you spent $50,000 on those children in recent weeks. Hospital, apartment, food, clothes, $50,000 that we no longer have." "David, no, Dad. Now I'm going to talk." The young man stood up, gesturing nervously. "You let yourself be carried away by emotion and lost focus on business. While you were playing social dad, our manager was destroying everything you built in 20 years. The accusation hurt because it had a basis in truth. Richard had indeed been distracted by Isabel's situation, but it was impossible to regret having saved the girl's life. "What are you suggesting?" asked Richard wearily. "That we stop spending money on charity and focus on saving the company, fire all non-essential employees, sell the most expensive equipment, cut all superfluous expenses." David paused significantly. "And stop supporting those children." "Never! Dad, be rational. You can't save everyone." "I can save them, and I will save them." David took a deep breath as if he were preparing for something. "Then you leave me no choice." He took an envelope from the file. "I've already spoken with Dr. Miller, our family lawyer. I'm going to file a lawsuit to take control of the company." Richard was paralyzed. You're suing me? I'm trying to save our inheritance. Dr. Miller believes we have a good chance, considering your recent irrational decisions. David avoided his father's gaze. I'm going to claim that you are mentally unstable due to stress and are making decisions that are detrimental to the company. The betrayal of his own son was more painful than all the financial problems combined. Richard stood up slowly, feeling as if he had aged 10 years at that moment. You have 24 hours to reconsider, said David, his voice trembling but determined. Either give up control voluntarily, or I'll do it judicially. Richard left the office without saying a word. On the street, he realized that he was trembling, not from cold, but from an explosive mixture of anger, sadness, and despair. In a matter of weeks, he had lost his company, his financial security, and now faced a legal war with his own son. When he arrived at the small apartment where Isabel lived, he found a scene that almost made him collapse. The girl was sitting on the living room floor, holding a photo of her mother and crying silently. Isabel, what happened? Mr. Huntington, she raised her red eyes to him. I dreamed about my mom today. She was sad with me. Why do you think that? Because you're suffering because of us. I heard Grandpa Walter talking to Betty. He said that you're losing money because of us. Richard knelt next to the girl, feeling his heart break. Isabel, none of this is your fault. Yes, it is, like my mom. She died because I fought with her. Now you're going to be without money because you took care of us. The girl sobbed. I'm really a pest. At that moment, Richard understood that he had failed completely. Trying to save Isabel, he had inadvertently increased her guilt. The girl now felt responsible not only for her mother's death, but also for his problems. And worst of all, with the company going bankrupt and David suing him, maybe he really wouldn't be able to continue helping her. For the first time since he met Isabel, Richard wondered if David wasn't right, if he had really let emotion speak louder than reason. But when he looked again at those sad eyes full of guilt, he knew that he couldn't give up, even if it cost him everything he possessed. 2 months had passed since Valerie disappeared with the company's money. Richard's situation had become a complete nightmare. David had obtained a court injunction that froze all of the company's accounts, claiming that his father was mentally unstable to manage the business. I can no longer pay for their apartment, said Richard on the phone to his lawyer, Dr. Reynolds, the only one who agreed to defend him. David blocked everything. I don't have access to even my own resources. The situation is complicated, Richard. Your son presented as evidence your impulsive decisions in recent months. The judge is taking the allegation of mental instability seriously. Richard hung up the phone and looked out the window of his personal office. Down below, on the street, he could see some people talking and pointing to the building. The news of his situation had spread throughout the city. For many, he was now the greedy businessman who was pretending to help street children to improve his public image. A knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. It was Walter, but his normally gentle face was marked by worry. Mr. Huntington, I need to talk to you. Come in, Walter, what happened? The elderly man sat heavily in a chair. It's about Betty. She disappeared last night. Richard felt the world collapse once more. What do you mean, disappeared? She and Isabel argued. Betty was angry because we didn't have enough food. She said that before, on the street, they could at least scavenge something. Walter wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. She shouted that life was worse after they met you, that at least before they had no hope of losing. The guilt that Richard felt was suffocating. And Isabel? She doesn't say anything anymore, doesn't eat anything. She spent all night waiting for her sister to come back. Walter hesitated before continuing. Mr. Huntington, maybe it's better for them to go back to the street. At least they survived there. No, I won't give up on them. But you no longer have how to help. and they are suffering more now than before. Before Richard could answer, his cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello? Mr. Drummond, this is Dr. Clark from the city hospital. We have here a man who was attacked. He said he knows you. Walter Stevens. Richard looked at Walter, who was there in front of him. There must be a mistake, doctor. Walter is here with me. No, sir. The patient said that there are two Walters, that Mr. Drummond would understand. A pang of panic hit Richard. Let's go to the hospital now, he said to Walter. At the hospital, they found a man in his 40s, beaten and with a swollen face. When he saw them, he tried to smile despite the pain. Mr. Drummond, I'm Frank Stevens, Walter's nephew. The people on the street call me New Walter. What happened? To you? Some men caught me last night. They said it was to give a message to you. Frank breathed with difficulty. They know about Betty. Richard felt his blood run cold. What story is this? The girl was taken by some drug dealers who want to use the children to sell drugs. They know that you care about her. Frank grabbed Richard's arm. They said that if you don't stop making a fuss about the street children, the girl will disappear for good. Walter turned pale. What kind of fuss? Your investigation into Valerie has drawn attention. There are powerful people involved in all of this, people who don't want certain things to come to light. Richard realized that he had gotten himself into something much bigger than he imagined. Valerie wasn't just a dishonest employee. She was part of something bigger, and now dangerous people were using Betty to silence him. That night, Richard returned to the small apartment where Isabel was waiting. The girl was sitting at the window, looking at the street as if she expected to see her sister return. Isabel, he sat next to her. We're going to find Betty. The girl looked at him with empty eyes. No, you're not, like my mom. Everyone I love goes away and never comes back. That's not true. Yes, it is. My mom left because I was bad to her. Betty left because I couldn't take care of her properly, and you're also going to leave because I only bring trouble. Richard felt his heart break as he saw how a 6-year-old had internalized so much guilt. Isabel, look at me. She reluctantly turned her face towards him. I'm never going away. No matter what happens to me, to my money, to my company, I'm going to take care of you. But you don't have any more money. I heard Grandpa Walter talking. Money isn't everything, honey. Your mother taught me that. Isabel frowned. How is it that my mother taught you? You didn't even know her. Richard realized that he had said too much, revealing a connection that he didn't yet fully understand. It's that, knowing you, I feel like I know your mother too. The girl studied his face for long moments. Mr. Huntington, why do you care so much about us? Really? It was a question he had been trying to answer for months. Looking into those sad eyes that carried an impossible weight for a child, Richard finally understood. Because you taught me to feel again, he said with simplicity. 10 years ago, I was dead inside. You brought me back to life. At that moment, there was a knock on the apartment door. Walter opened it and found David standing there with an expression that Richard couldn't decipher. "Dad," said the young man, entering slowly, "I need to talk to you." Richard stood up, preparing for another confrontation with his son. But David looked at Isabel, sitting small and fragile by the window, and something in his expression changed. "It's about the company," he said, his voice strangely choked. "I've discovered something that changes everything." David entered the apartment with hesitant steps, carrying a yellowed file. His face was different, no longer the arrogant expression of always, but something close to regret. "Dad, I found Valerie," he said, sitting heavily in a chair. "She didn't run away. She's been hospitalized in Rochester for 2 months, in a coma after a car accident." Richard frowned. "What do you mean? And the money she stole?" "It wasn't her." David opened the file and spread documents on the table. "Dad, I need to confess something terrible. I was the one who forged the transfers and stole the company's money. The silence that followed was deafening. Walter stopped breathing. Isabel, even in her apathetic state, turned her attention to the conversation. Richard felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. You? I was in gambling debt, huge debts with dangerous people. David avoided his father's gaze. I started small, thinking I could quickly replace the money, but the debts only grew. And Valerie? She was innocent. She discovered the irregularities in the books and came to confront me before telling you. I blackmailed her. David's voice failed. I said that if she said anything, I would frame her for the thefts. She was afraid and started acting nervous, suspecting everything. Richard slumped into a chair, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. So you let me accuse an innocent person. You let me believe that she had destroyed our company. And worse. David took a sheet of paper from the file. This is a medical certificate for Lucy Silver. She didn't die of a heart attack caused by the stress of the dismissal. Isabel approached slowly, as if sensing that something important about her mother would be revealed. What did she die of then? Asked Richard. Untreated severe anemia, the same thing that Isabel has. David looked at the girl gently. Her heart stopped because she was sick for months and didn't know. The doctor said there was nothing that could have prevented it. Isabel stopped breathing. My mom didn't die because of me? No, honey, your mom was very sick. The fight you had nothing to do with her death. The girl collapsed on the floor, sobbing as if all the months of guilt were finally leaving her body. Walter picked her up, whispering words of comfort. But there's more, continued David, taking out another document. I found this in Valerie's personal files. A letter that Lucy wrote to you, Dad, but never delivered. Richard took the letter with trembling hands and began to read aloud. Mr. Huntington, I don't know if I should write this letter, but I feel I need to. I've been working at your bakery for a few months and have always admired you as a fair boss, but I've discovered something that worries me a lot. There are irregularities in the inventories that I can't explain. Products that disappear, suppliers who receive double payments. I don't want to accuse anyone without certainty, but I think someone is stealing from the company. As I'm just a cleaner, maybe no one will believe me. But you are a good man and deserve to know the truth. I didn't sign my name out of fear, but if you want to talk to me, I'll be at Central Bakery every Thursday after closing time. With respect, an employee who cares. Richard finished reading with a choked voice. She knew. Lucy knew you were stealing and tried to warn me. That's why Valerie was nervous, said David. She was trying to protect you from discovering the truth about me. When Lucy started asking questions, Valerie panicked and fired her, thinking that would make the problem disappear. At that moment, the door opened and a woman in her 40s entered the apartment. She was brunette, with features that resembled Isabel, wearing a nurse's uniform. Excuse me for intruding, she said, looking around nervously. Are Lucy Silver's daughters here? Isabel raised her head from Walter's arms, wiping her eyes. Who are you? My name is Emily. I'm your mother's sister, your aunt. The room fell silent. Isabel looked at the woman as if she were seeing a ghost. My aunt? My mom never talked about you. Your mother and I argued a few years ago over a stupid thing. She moved away and we lost contact. Emily approached slowly. I only found out that she had died last week when I was able to locate her death certificate. Since then, I've been looking for you two. And Betty? Asked Isabel, hopefully. She's with me in my car downstairs. Emily smiled. Some neighbors told me where to find her. She was very scared, but when I explained who I was and showed her old photos with your mother, she trusted me. Isabel ran to the window and saw Betty waving from the back seat of a car. It was the first time in months that Richard had seen a genuine smile on the girl's face. I work as a nurse at the county hospital in Rochester, continued Emily. I have a nice house with a yard near an excellent school. I can take good care of the girls. David stood up, going to the window. Dad, there's one last thing I need to confess. Richard looked at him, exhausted from so many revelations. The drug dealers who threatened Frank were thugs from the loan sharks I owed. When they found out that you were investigating irregularities, they were afraid that you would find out about my debts and pressure me to denounce them. David took a deep breath. They took Betty to pressure me to stop you, but when they saw that the situation was getting out of control, they handed the girl over to the first person who appeared looking for her. Why are you confessing everything now? Asked Richard. Because I met Isabel. I saw what she was going through. David looked at the girl, who was now smiling out the window at her sister. And I remembered Mom, what she taught me about doing what's right, even when it's difficult. 3 months later, Richard was at the renovated Central Bakery, serving pastries to a group of children from the neighborhood. David had returned all the stolen money and was serving a community service sentence. Valerie, recovered from the accident, had returned to work and was now one of the most dedicated employees, grateful for the second chance. Walter worked as a coordinator for a social program of the bakeries, helping other homeless people find work and dignity. The company had not only recovered financially, but now had a greater purpose. Mr. Huntington, Isabel's cheerful voice echoed through the bakery. She ran in, followed by Betty and Emily. The girls came every Sunday to help distribute bread to needy families. How are you, my little ones? We're fine, replied Isabel, hugging him tight. Aunt Emily said I can write a letter to my mom, to tell her that now I know she didn't die because of me. Richard knelt down to get to the girl's height. And what else are you going to tell her? That I met an angel on earth, she said, smiling. An angel who taught me that there is always hope, even when everything seems lost. As he watched the girls helping to serve the bread, Richard finally understood what Olivia had tried to tell him years ago. Money really wasn't everything. The true wealth was in those smiles, in that second chance, in the ability to transform pain into love and despair into hope. Isabel no longer asked to die. Now she helped others find reasons to live.